Think your Monday morning commute is rough? Try marching through the Pyrenees with 25,000 men, drunk on conquest, only to have your entire army obliterated by a Christian warlord you'd never even heard of. In 721 AD, Duke Odo of Aquitaine did something that should have been impossible. He took 3,000 warriors and turned the seemingly unstoppable Umayyad Caliphate's invasion force into a lesson in medieval humiliation. The clash at Toulouse was so catastrophic for the Muslim forces that the chroniclers literally ran out of words to describe the carnage. And here's the kicker. Most people have never even heard of this battle, even though it happened 11 years before Charles Martel's famous stand at Tours. So why did history forget the day when mathematics stopped mattering, and sheer, bloody-minded desperation rewrote the rules of medieval warfare? Before we wade into this bloodbath, do something for me. If you believe history isn't just dates and dusty textbooks, but the raw, violent, utterly insane truth of human survival, smash that like button. Subscribe because we're not just reciting facts, we're uncovering the forgotten battles that shaped Western civilization. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's descend into the Siege of Toulouse, where the impossible became reality and thousands died proving it. Let's set the stage for one of medieval history's most lopsided victories. It's 721 AD, and the Umayyad Caliphate is experiencing what we might call aggressive expansion syndrome. In less than 90 years, they'd conquered territory stretching from Persia to the Atlantic Ocean. We're talking about an empire that made Rome look like it had commitment issues. By 711, they'd crossed into Iberia and absolutely demolished the Visigothic kingdom, a Christian realm that had stood for nearly 3 centuries, in basically an afternoon. King Roderick's entire army? Gone. His kingdom? Now called Al-Andalus. The conquest was so swift that Muslim commanders were probably checking their maps twice, thinking, wait, that's it? The governor leading this charge into Frankish territory was Al-Samh ibn Malik al-Khawlani, and this man was no joke. He'd been handpicked by Caliph Umar II himself. Think of it as getting the medieval equivalent of a 5-star Yelp review from God's representative on earth. Al-Samh looked at the Pyrenees Mountains, that natural barrier that had protected Gaul for centuries, and basically said, adorable. By 719, he'd established Narbonne as a forward operating base on the northern side of the mountains. Imagine the psychological impact. It's like waking up to find your enemy has set up camp in your driveway and is casually grilling kebabs while planning your demise. But Al-Samh wanted more than just a foothold. He wanted Aquitaine, the wealthy duchy that controlled southwestern Gaul. Its Duke Odo the Great had a problem. He was technically a vassal to the Frankish kingdom, but the relationship was, how do we put this delicately, complicated. Charles Martel, the Frankish mayor of the palace, and Odo had recently been trying to split each other's skulls open in their own Christian-on-Christian violence. Medieval politics made Game of Thrones look like a friendly neighborhood barbecue. So when Al-Samh came marching north with somewhere between 20,000 to 25,000 warriors, the chronicles vary, but all agree on a terrifying amount. Odo couldn't exactly speed dial Charles for backup without admitting he needed help from his rival. Here's where it gets deliciously ironic. Al-Samh had every reason to feel confident. His forces had battle-hardened cavalry, experienced infantry, and the momentum of nearly a century of unbroken victories. The Umayyad military machine had crushed the Byzantines, the Persians, and everyone in between. They had superior tactics, better discipline, and honestly, they had every right to look at Odo's force and think, this will be done by lunch. But this is where the historical record gets spicy, because what happened next violated every rule of medieval warfare. Al-Samh's strategy was textbook medieval conquest. Lay siege to the major city, starve them out, and watch the duchy collapse like a house of cards. Toulouse wasn't just any city, it was Aquitaine's crown jewel, a Roman-era fortress city with walls that had stood for centuries. The Muslim force surrounded it completely in June of 721, cutting off all supply routes. Inside those walls, thousands of civilians watched their food supplies dwindle, knowing that surrender meant slavery or death, and resistance meant the same thing, just slower. The chronicles talk about people eating leather, rats, anything to survive. One account mentions civilians boiling their belts for soup. Medieval WebMD's diagnosis? You're probably going to die. Al-Samh had time on his side, or so he thought. His supply lines stretched back through Narbonne to Al-Andalus, hundreds of miles of controlled territory. He could wait months if needed, but Duke Odo was facing a nightmare scenario that would make any military commander's blood run cold. He had maybe 3,000 warriors. Some chronicles say as few as 2,500. We're talking about odds worse than 8 to 1, possibly 10 to 1. To put that in perspective, That's like bringing a butter knife to a gun convention and expecting to win the quick draw competition. But Odo had something Al-Samh didn't: intimate knowledge of the terrain and sheer desperation. See, when you're defending your homeland against an invasion force that's already conquered half the known world, you don't fight fair, you fight mean. Odo spent weeks shadowing the Muslim army, staying just out of reach, watching their patterns, waiting for the perfect moment. His scouts mapped every movement, every supply convoy, every shift change. It was medieval special operations warfare, and Odo was running the most dangerous reconnaissance mission of his life. Then, on June 9th, 721, Odo saw his opening. Al-Samh, confident in his numerical superiority, had split his forces. Part of his army maintained the siege, while others had spread out to forage and secure the surrounding countryside. It's the military equivalent of winning so much you start playing sloppy. Odo struck like a medieval thunderbolt, hitting the siege forces in a coordinated assault that caught the Umayyads completely off guard. Imagine being so certain of victory that you're literally camped outside city walls, maybe sharpening your sword or writing letters home about the loot you're about to acquire, when suddenly 3,000 screaming Franks and Aquitanians come crashing into your camp like the apocalypse showed up early. The battle was pure chaos. Medieval combat wasn't the organized formations you see in movies. It was a meat grinder of swinging blades, crushing maces, and men screaming in half a dozen languages. The Franks fought with the desperation of men defending their homes, while the Umayyads, caught in poor defensive positions, struggled to form proper battle lines. The chronicles describe the fighting as lasting from dawn until the streets of the siege camp ran red. One Christian account, probably exaggerating but capturing the spirit, claimed you couldn't walk 10 feet without stepping on a corpse. The smell alone, blood, split intestines, voided bowels from the dead, would have been overwhelming. Medieval battlefields smelled like an abattoir mixed with a latrine, amplified by summer heat. Here's where the battle reached its crescendo, and Al-Samh's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day got exponentially worse. During the brutal melee, Duke Odo's warriors managed to do the one thing that turns any medieval battle into a complete catastrophe for the losing side. They killed the commander. Al-Samh ibn Malik, governor of Al-Andalus, the man personally chosen by the Caliph, the leader who'd conquered cities from Toledo to Toulouse, took a mortal wound in the fighting. The sources disagree on exactly how. Some say a spear, others a sword thrust, but they all agree on the result. The supreme commander of the Umayyad forces was down. In medieval warfare, killing the commander wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological nuclear bomb. There's no radios, no clear chain of command notifications, no organized retreat procedures. When word spread through the Muslim ranks that Al-Samh had fallen, it triggered a collapse that turned an organized army into a panicked mob. Imagine being a soldier, already fighting desperately against enemies who seem to be everywhere at once, then learning your leader is dead. The mental calculation happens instantly. Do I die for a siege that's suddenly meaningless, or do I try to survive the next 5 minutes? Quote, thousands chose survival. The Umayyad forces broke and ran, and that's when a battle becomes a slaughter. See, when two armies are fighting face to face, casualties are relatively balanced, but when one side runs, that's when the real killing starts. Retreating soldiers expose their backs. No shields, no defense, just desperate men trying to outrun death. The Frankish and Aquitanian forces pursued them like wolves chasing wounded deer. The roads leading south toward Narbonne became killing fields. Chronicles mention bodies piled so thick that later travelers had to detour around the rotting mounds. The numbers are staggering. Christian sources claim 375,000 Muslim soldiers died, which is obvious propaganda. You can't kill 15 times more soldiers than actually existed, but even the more conservative Muslim chronicles admit to great slaughter and losses in the thousands. Modern historians estimate the Umayyad forces lost somewhere between 10,000 to 15,000 men, potentially more than half their entire invasion force. For context, that's like losing an entire modern military division in a single afternoon. Al-Samh himself died from his wounds shortly after the battle, probably in excruciating agony, as medieval medicine was essentially pray harder and maybe drink some wine. But it gets worse for the Caliphate's prestige. Not only did they lose the battle and their governor, but they also lost all their siege equipment, their supply trains, and most devastating of all, their aura of invincibility. For 90 years, the Umayyad military had been the terminator of medieval armies, seemingly unstoppable and inevitable. Duke Odo and his 3,000 warriors just showed everyone that the emperor had no clothes, or in this case, that the caliphate could bleed. Let's talk about why this massive civilization-altering victory got shoved into history's dustbin while the Battle of Toulouse 11 years later, gets all the glory. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. History is written by whoever has the better PR team, and Charles Martel had a really good PR team. After Toulouse, Duke Odo became the hero of Christendom. Pope Gregory II literally sent him congratulatory letters. For a moment, Odo was the most famous Christian warrior in Western Europe, the man who done the impossible and stopped the Islamic expansion cold. But medieval politics are ruthlessly practical. Odo's victory, as spectacular as it was, didn't actually end the Umayyad threat. It slowed them down, created breathing room, bought time, but it didn't close the door. The Caliphate forces regrouped, reinforced, and came back angrier. By 732, they were pushing north again, this time under Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, who'd learned from Al-Samh's mistakes. When they invaded again, Odo had to swallow his pride and beg Charles Martel for help. That alliance led to the Battle of Toulouse, where Charles and Odo together defeated the Muslim forces again. But the chroniclers, especially those loyal to the Carolingian dynasty, made sure Charles got top billing. Charles Martel, whose nickname literally means the hammer, understood something crucial about medieval power. Victory is meaningless if nobody remembers it was yours. His scribes and supporters made Tours into the pivotal battle that saved Christianity, conveniently downplaying Toulouse. It's the medieval equivalent of taking credit for your colleague's work in a meeting. Over the centuries, Toulouse faded from popular memory while Tours became the stuff of legend. Gibbon, the famous historian, literally wrote that Tours was one of the most important battles in world history, potentially preventing the conquest of all Europe. Meanwhile, Toulouse, barely a footnote. But here's what makes the Siege of Toulouse so significant. It proved that the Umayyad expansion could be stopped, and more importantly, it proved that numerical superiority meant nothing against desperate defenders who knew the terrain and were willing to take insane risks. Odo's victory showed that the Caliphate wasn't playing a different game. They could be beaten by conventional medieval tactics if you were brave enough or crazy enough to try. 3,000 men against 25,000. Those are fantasy novel odds, yet it happened, and the consequences rippled across Europe for decades. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For Christians across Gaul and beyond, Toulouse was proof that God hadn't abandoned them to the Muslim conquests. Prayer, they believed, combined with sharp steel and tactical brilliance, could turn the tide. For the Umayyad Caliphate, Toulouse was a wake-up call that the soft underbelly of Europe wasn't so soft after all. They'd need to commit more resources, plan more carefully, and respect their opponent's capability for violence. What makes the Battle of Toulouse so fascinating isn't just the lopsided numbers or the dramatic victory. It's what it reveals about medieval warfare that nobody teaches in school. First, technology and training didn't guarantee victory the way we think it should. The Umayyad forces had better cavalry tactics, superior mobility, decades of combat experience against the Byzantine and Persian empires. They should have crushed Odo's forces like an afterthought. But warfare isn't a video game where better stats guarantee victory. It's chaos, luck, timing, and the willingness to commit to absurdly dangerous strategies. Second, the battle shows how fragile medieval command structures were. One spear thrust, one lucky sword swing, and an entire invasion force collapses because there's no clear succession plan in the middle of combat. Modern militaries spend enormous resources on redundant command structures for exactly this reason. In 721 AD, your commander dies, and suddenly 20,000 soldiers are making independent decisions about whether to keep fighting or start running. It's organizational chaos theory played out with sharp objects. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Toulouse demonstrates the danger of overconfidence. Al-Samh had every rational reason to believe he'd win. The math, the history, the resources, everything pointed to Umayyad victory. But he underestimated his opponent's desperation and overestimated his own security. It's the same mistake countless generals have made throughout history, assuming that because you've won before, you'll keep winning. Duke Odo was fighting for survival, while Al-Samh was fighting for expansion. That difference in motivation mattered more than any tactical manual. The battle also reveals something uncomfortable about how we remember history. We celebrate Charles Martel at Tours because it fits a cleaner narrative. The Franks stopping the Muslims, the beginning of Carolingian dominance, the salvation of Christian Europe. But Toulouse was messier, a rebellious duke fighting without support from the Frankish kingdom, achieving an even more impossible victory through sheer audacity. It doesn't fit the narrative of unified Christian resistance that medieval chroniclers wanted to tell, so it got quietly forgotten. So the next time you face impossible odds, maybe a deadline that seems unmeetable, or a challenge that feels insurmountable, Remember Duke Odo looking at 25,000 enemy soldiers with only 3,000 men and deciding, yeah, we're doing this. Sure, your stakes probably don't involve mass carnage and the fate of Western civilization. But the principle holds. Sometimes the impossible is just the difficult wearing better marketing. The Siege of Toulouse should be remembered as one of the most audacious military victories in medieval history. 3,000 warriors, facing 10-to-1 odds, not only surviving but completely demolishing an invasion force that had conquered half the known world. It happened 11 years before Tours, with worse odds, and yet history barely remembers Duke Odo's name. That's the lesson here. It's not enough to do the impossible. You also need good publicists. Which aspect of this forgotten battle shocked you most? The ridiculous odds? The fact that it's been overshadowed by Tours? The sheer brutality of medieval siege warfare? Drop it in the comments, because I want to know what resonates with you. If this made you grateful that your biggest battle is usually with morning traffic rather than 25,000 invading warriors, subscribe for more historical nightmares that'll make your worst day look like a spa vacation. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another forgotten medieval battle that rewrote the map of Europe. Until then, maybe appreciate that your Monday morning problems don't involve holding off the largest empire on Earth with a force that wouldn't fill a modern football stadium.